we're here to discuss how social media is changing political reporting. And sitting at my right is the woman known as @Annabelle Crabb or @CrabbTwitsard, depending on which account you follow, CrabbTwitsard being the scintillating Twitter account for the live microblogging of parliamentary question time in Canberra. And some of the people she's sitting with also participate in that process, along with a whole bunch of you guys. Annabelle has just been appointed as the ABC's chief political writer online. Formerly, she was a political columnist and sketch writer for the Sydney Morning Herald. In fact, I think she still is with the Sydney Morning Herald, despite what her bio suggests. She joined the Parliamentary Press Gallery in 1999 and has covered politics ever since, aside from a 3-year break as a correspondent for Fairfax's Sunday titles in London. This is a quote from Annabelle's bio, which she did write herself, unlike Malcolm Turnbull and some of his tweets. Annabelle's unfortunate tendency to maim and kill laptop computers in bizarre ways — she once baked one in her oven — hasn't hindered her enthusiasm for Twitter, and she's a regular tweeter of parliamentary question time. Annabelle was born and raised in country South Australia and now lives in Sydney with her partner and toddler daughter. She's expecting another baby in February, and as many of you will know, she's a regular panellist on TV's Insiders. Sitting next to Annabelle, we have Bernard Keane. Bernard studied history at the University of Sydney and in 1993 joined the Federal Public Service in Canberra. Since then, he has been a public servant, a speechwriter and a blogger. In February 2008, he joined Crikey as its Canberra correspondent, and he works in the Canberra Parliamentary Press Gallery. Chris Uhlmann, the Marcel Marceau of Twitter, who now has uttered a post or two, is the ABC's political editor of the 7:30 report. And I'm getting him back because for a brief period in the distant past, Chris produced me on breakfast radio in Canberra on 666. You did a fabulous job and I sounded half credible, so he's very welcome on this panel. Chris was appointed to his current role as the political editor for the 7:30 report in August 2009, after 3 years of working in the Canberra Press Gallery as the political editor for ABC TV News and as the chief political correspondent for Radio Current Affairs. Chris quickly distinguished himself as one of the most astute and informed journalists in Canberra, and in 2008 he won the Walkley for broadcast interviewing. Prior to his work in the Press Gallery, Chris was the producer of Melbourne's ABC Local Radio morning program, a presenter on ABC Local Radio Canberra's breakfast program, and a reporter and editor in the print media. And I seem to recall you once toyed with the priesthood, but we'll come to that later.
We won't.
Caroline Overington is a 2-time winner of the Walkley Award for Investigative Journalism, a winner of the Sir Keith Murdoch Prize for Journalism, a mother of twins and an author of 3 books, including Kickback, which won the Blake Dawson Prize for Literature. She has a new novel called Ghost Child by Random House, which explores the mystery and the horror of child murder. And if you can judge by the Twit reviews that we've seen, it's a ripper. Hopefully I'll get to it sometime when my baby is old enough to sleep through the night. And John Kerrison at the end of our panel, a relative newcomer to Twitter and a sometime political correspondent for Channel 9 News. Prior to that, he was with the ABC in South Australia. He's got the shortest bio of any of the speakers at this conference, which
Maybe
I think says something for his humility. Yeah. He's just completed his master's degree and has embraced the power of new media. So that's the team, and we'll start with Annabelle.
You'd be amazed how comically regularly that happens to me, or not. Hello, lovely to be here. I'm not going to go on forever because of a couple of inevitabilities. One, that none of us has very long before Caroline Overington turns the topic into with a contemporary literary endeavour in an attempt to further plug her new novel. It's very good, I should say. It's a pleasure to be here with this distinguished panel, four of us Twitterers and one Trappist monk in the middle there. Chris 5 times Uhlmann, as I now propose to call him for the rest of his life. He's in good company with, Silvio 6 times Berlusconi. Did you see that fantastic story recently where, he got caught out with that call girl and she released a recording of him boasting about, that's 6 times now or something, and his office later explained that he was referring to the number of times that he had hosted the G8. Best excuse ever. I must tweet that to the Prime Minister next time he's in a spot, which is round about now, that's right. I want to start by just racing through a couple of random epiphanies that we owe to Twitter over the last 12 months or so. When we look at the change that Twitter has made to political journalism, it's kind of thrown up some funny little results. We've learned some things about some politicians that we previously didn't know. For instance, we now know the depth and extent of the Prime Minister's spelling difficulties. He should probably form some sort of solidarity group with Steve Fielding, judging by some of his remarks on Twitter. I mean, this is a man who is prepared to pioneer the use of the phrase detailed programmatic specificity in Germany. The odds that he can actually spell any of those words seem startlingly narrow on past performance. He can't spell Mary MacKillop or Gorgon, according to a close examination of his Twitter. He's actually got about 800,000 followers on Twitter at the moment, Kevin Rudd. I mean, he is very much the most popular and most widely followed politician on Twitter in Australia. Most of them seem to be in San Francisco, which hints at some nightclub tendencies that go beyond those with which we're already thrillingly familiar. Still, keep your eyes peeled, tweeps. We've also learnt that actually, if things go badly for the Prime Minister, he could actually find work as a photographer for the Australian Financial Review. Did you see that fantastic tweet of his last week, which was just a photograph of his own boot, surrounded by dead bogong moths? That was a good moment. I'm not sure what it meant. It was a bit avant-garde. That's why I think, page 3 of the Fin is his sort of photographic destiny. Twitter's also reinforced the perception that Malcolm Turnbull is very much a dog person. That's something that we also pick up from looking at his dog blogs, of course, but it's good to have these things confirmed. That's the thing about Twitter, isn't it? I mean, it's a proliferation of information. Sometimes there's too much information. Anybody who's been getting Joe Hockey's breastfeeding tweets over the last couple of weeks might begin to agree, I guess. Look, to be serious, I mean, the last couple of months have actually generated a bit of a first in the sense that the first federal political news story that was generated through Twitter has dominated the play in Canberra for a few hours or so, which is about as much as any issue can hope to dominate the airplay for these days. This happened a couple of weeks ago when, in the midst of a back and forth in question time about which consisted of the Prime Minister and Treasurer talking about their unapologetically courageous and characterful approach to the global financial crisis on one side, and on the other side, Malcolm Turnbull really wanting to know about boats. There was a reference to the G20, and Joe Hockey tweeted that the G20 was a bunch of left-wing lunatics. I paraphrase slightly here, but not very much. And that was during question time. The Libs do tend to tweet a bit during question time. I think they're allowed to. I think that some of the Labor MPs have been debarked slightly, I think Kevin Rudd is like one of those careful cat owners that make sure that, they're spayed before they leave the property. I don't see too many of them trawling around on Twitter sharing their thoughts. A few of them have sort of cleared their throats on the Labor side, but they're predominantly backbenchers. But Joe Hockey is absolutely unleashed on Twitter, and so he lodged a comment that was broadly condemning of the G20. And David Spears from Sky News, who happened to be listening in, noted the message and asked Joe Hockey about it on air after question time, whereupon it kind of entered into the news cycle, and the Prime Minister responded predictably. I mean, he was sort of about 10 yards out and dead in front of the sticks, really, given that there are some quite prominent political members of the G20 that aren't terribly left-wing. It turned into quite a tidy little news package for the evening news. Look, that's, I think, to my memory, the first time that a comment made on Twitter in federal politics has spawned a sort of straight political news story. I think that'll happen more and more. In South Australia, you see Mike Rann, the Premier, actually taking over Twitter to make announcements. I think he's actually dispensed with the services of a couple of ministers through this medium, which is very much a nice, clean way to do it. Most political leaders kind of dream about developing the perfect way to sack someone from the bath, and Twitter is starting to look very much like it. But what else has it done besides democratise the chatter in Parliament House? I wanted to just share a few things that I like about Twitter. When I signed up, I had all of the usual reservations, like, doesn't this sound like the most inane thing ever invented, and that sort of thing. But here's what, after a few months, I really like about Twitter as part of the political reporting process. Best thing about it is that it's self-selecting, and if someone wants to be bored rigid by my constant nattering about what's going on in question time, then they opt in. I'm not kind of shoving it down anybody's throats. They identify themselves as an audience that's interested. And it seems to me that in the modern media universe, beset as it is by all these dreadful, intractable problems, a mechanism that allows people to choose themselves to come to you is kind of a rather blessed sort of thing. The other thing is, of course, that it's a conversation. One of the great things that has taken place in Parliament House recently, it's only been a couple of months since the security guards started letting us take devices into the press gallery. Before that, you used to get in trouble if you didn't have a tie. And various ladies have been approached over the years too and asked to put on a tie. I mean, I won't mention Margot Kingston, but it did happen to her once. Terrible. Anyway, but more specifically, people get frisked for devices, and while you can watch Peter Costello down on the floor in his backbench seat writing out his job applications on his laptop, we'd be sitting up there with nothing more sophisticated than pens and paper. But the great authorities that rule Parliament House decided several months ago that we could take in phones and iPhones and laptops and Blackberries and so on, which is why you've seen this kind of flood of political journalists onto Twitter, which means, of course, that we can talk to people as well. And I write a column about, what goes on in question time. It's sort of observational, bit of a piss take, make a point here and there. And I find that it's like public note-taking, Twitter. You just sort of, rather than jotting down your instant thoughts into a notebook, you're kind of just putting them out there. And then people kind of give you responses, which is fantastic. It's also great for, unreconstructed intellectual property thieves like myself. I do try and, acknowledge the funniest ones, but some things I do lift, I'm sorry. I apologise to all of you. You're probably all in this room, sorry. Anyway. The other thing that it allows, of course, is live heckling of politicians, which is always excellent fun. And there's always someone who will respond live so that you can actually lock eyes with them while you're having a Twitter back and forth. And that's rather invigorating for all concerned, I think. So they're the things that I like about it, People can join in if they want to and don't have to if they don't want to. I love that element of choice and kind of randomness about it. There are some natural constraints, of course, and the first one has to be authenticity. I enjoy the work of many of the fake politicians on Twitter. In some cases, they are more convincing than the real ones. And sometimes you can't quite tell the difference. I love the way a couple of weeks ago there was a sort of rather incendiary quote from fake Sophie Mirabella, who managed to be more provocative even than real Sophie Mirabella, which takes some doing. And she was enthusiastically followed by the Liberal Club or something, who thoroughly endorsed her remarks, not quite realising that they were in jest. But, I mean, that's what happens. It's a problem for us, though, of course, because sorting out who's real and who isn't is a major problem for journalists. It's the sort of thing we're supposed to be good at, and when we get caught out, it's kind of a bit of a Richard Wilkins moment. You don't want to have those moments. The other problem, of course, is participation. All of the advantages of politics on Twitter rather depend on everybody eligible participating. Because of the debarking scenario going on the Labor side of the House, we do have some problems in that sense. And I hope that will amend itself over time. I don't hope, I think my hope is not terribly realistic on that front. But so how has Twitter changed political reporting? Well, it's changed it. It hasn't revolutionised it, I think, yet. Unless you're using the term revolutionary in the education revolution sense, in the sense that a few outbuildings have gone up and they seem to be working well. It's not really, one of the actually revolutionary revolutions yet, but it has potential. And I think that the great key to Twitter and its usefulness is that political practitioners and reporters recognise that it signifies a loss of control, and they have to relax with that. Whether it's for politicians, the reality that they lose control over the right to their own name, their own ability to control their image. I think that's been coming for a long time online, and some of them are dealing better with it than others. And for the press gallery, I mean, hardly anyone ever misses an opportunity to accuse the press gallery of being out of touch and elitist and so on. I think this is a real key to giving people an insight into the gallery and input into the way journalists work. We've all got to be big enough to take the hilarious brickbats that come flying pretty regularly through this new medium and just pucker up and enjoy it, I think. That's what I like about it. Thank you.
Sorry, I've got to stay here. Do you mind going? Wouldn't mind popping down the end. Thank you. Thanks, Annabelle. Bernard, would you like to take... I'm just going to be lazy and stay right here. So you can...
I'll do the getting up for us. Okay. Well, I wanted to start by asking at least those of you who are old enough to cast your minds back about 10 years to back around 2000, before the tech wreck. And if you're like me, you went to a lot of new media conferences and ICT conferences and those sorts of dues. They were very popular back then. And I remember there seemed to be two or three things that were always guaranteed. First, there'd be some Irish guy there who was always talking about, the Celtic Tiger and how we should all learn economic lessons from Ireland. And there'd be someone talking about the terrible consequences of the digital divide that was going to open up. And there'd invariably be someone from a marketing firm talking about the empowerment of consumers and the loss of control of the media. And being chock-a-block full of insight as I was back then, I kind of worked out reasonably quickly that was all rubbish for various reasons. The digital divide turned out to be, I think, way overstated, because in spite of the best efforts of Telstra, most homes actually do have an internet connection these days, and of course the vast majority have mobile telephony. And in particular, it was clear even then that when marketing people talked about how the internet would empower consumers, what they were really talking about was it would empower people like them to actually better advertise products to consumers. They were already counting the dollars from better targeting consumers and tracking the revealed preferences. Got to love those revealed preferences through online purchasing. So, in effect, a lot of it was one giant scam. It wasn't about freedom and empowerment at all. It was about people trying to sell things better. But the thing about when I sat down to try and work out what I was actually going to say at this point, which I still haven't sort of quite finished yet, it seems to me that Twitter, in a way, actually does fulfil a lot of those, a lot of that sort of thing that people were talking about back then. Not obviously about Ireland, as we saw. We learned that Ireland didn't quite stand up, but it seems to me that Twitter is entirely about consumer empowerment. You pick the feed you want, the journalists, the celebrities, the politicians that you want to follow, and it's a far flatter medium than any other. It obviously helps if you've got a media profile, but ultimately it serves up content without the existence of existing media structures. And Malcolm Turnbull talked about this morning. I thought Malcolm's remarks, when he gave that sort of little sort of brain snapshot about the evolution of the media, was actually very, very good. And the tweets of a Fairfax or a News Limited journalist on Twitter carry no more or less presence than that of an anonymous individual, which means to a great extent that the quality, to a greater extent than in the traditional media, it's the quality of the content that's important. And it's also, as Annabelle talked about, it also throws up some of that loss of control that used to be cherished as one of the joys of the internet. The internet was always, 10 years ago, it was all about breaking down barriers and revolutionising society. By putting a content delivery mechanism straight into the hands of politicians, and it's not just politicians, it's journalists, at least those few in the mainstream media who are actually allowed to tweet, or actors who annoy their studios by talking without their agent getting in the way, or anyone else who's normally filtered and used to having their public statements vetted and carefully packaged. We get what is, I think, going to be a fairly short interlude at the moment where we briefly get to see the real thoughts of these people that are normally kept hidden. I think what happened to Joe Hockey that Annabelle spoke about, I don't think we'll actually see very much of anymore, because I think those sort of shutters are going to come down, and in fact they have indeed already come down. They never even went up on the government side, because most government MPs don't tweet, and the ones that do tweet are mind-bogglingly anodyne, except for Tony Burke. Tony Burke's quite good, but everyone else, it's like reading a press release, or in fact it's actually just a link to a press release. So thanks for your comments, guys. Obviously, the Rudd government and they are absolutely ruthless in their control of their message. Obviously, I think they realised very, very quickly that Twitter was just another platform for them to control, and the last thing they wanted was backbenchers actually giving vent to what was actually on their minds. So we've got flattened, more democratic sort of media mechanism. We've got loss of control, but it's hardly a sort of a pure digital democracy. And I think that digital divide that people used to talk about in such breathless terms 10 years ago, I think is actually here as well. It's there's an obvious one, of course, between people who can spend their time on Twitter because it's enabled by the nature of our work. I'm basically talking about us. And then there's the rest of the population who have, either neither the capacity or perhaps the interest to actually connect up. But there's other sorts of divides that I think perhaps worry me more, or at least are ones that are more in our control and perhaps what we don't do as much about. And I think it springs from the empowering nature of Twitter. I think the empowering nature of Twitter tends to mean we gravitate toward what we're comfortable with, what we agree with. How many people actually follow someone with whom they violently disagree? Perhaps some people do just for the laughs, but it reinforces a tendency, I think, that was already there online, which is for people to really only go to the sort of content that they're comfortable with. So it's this old problem that that the fragmentation of the media partly means a sort of retreat into ghettos where everyone's in agreement with each other, rather than a common media space in which there are different viewpoints and they can interact and contest. And a consequence of that, I think, is that the old media, with all their financial problems and their declining audiences, are perversely in a way more valuable now than ever before, because they still offer this remaining vestige of a mass audience. And that's why I think the evening news bulletins and unfiltered radio remain the key means of government messaging and government spin control. And it's been fascinating this week to watch Kevin Rudd launch a good old-fashioned radio blitz in much the same way that Robert Menzies might have done, because he's obviously perceives that he needs to reinforce his message. Quite what all that adds up to, I'm not quite sure. I was hoping for some sort of inspirational summary moment. beyond sort of bagging the Irish economy. It's that I think, Malcolm's comment this morning that it's the message, not the medium, I think is actually critical. It's Twitter today, it might be Google Wave tomorrow, it will invariably be something else next year. The issue is the message and what people are actually trying to do with the message, and that's been the lesson of media for as long as there's been a media around. So that's all I've got to say.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you very much. Chris.
I just want to start by saying to Annabelle that it will be 6 times by tomorrow, 6. So Silvio Berlusconi and I will have... That's right. We heard earlier this morning a very famous quote about the media, and that is that news is something that somebody somewhere wants to suppress. And it goes on to say everything else is advertising. Now that was attributed then to Ed Morrow, a very famous American journalist. But if you go online and search for that comment, you'll find it attributed to at least a dozen people. One of them, a media baron who lived at the turn of the century. So who actually said that first? Was it him? Well, I'm not entirely sure, to tell you the truth now. It might have been Ed Morrow. It might have been someone from the BBC that I read that said it. But if you were to search on the internet, you couldn't be entirely sure by the end of that search that you knew exactly who had said that. One of the things I want to concentrate on today is the legacy media, and before we all rush to bury it, I'd like to praise it just a little, because something you can be certain about with the legacy media is identity, and that people have at least made an attempt at accuracy and verification. Now, they don't always get it right. We don't always get it right. But people do make an attempt to do that. There's an awful lot of information on the internet. A lot of it is simply white noise. And you have to find some way of searching through that. And I think for Twitter and a whole lot of other platforms, and let 1,000 platforms bloom as far as I'm concerned, but for all of these platforms, one of the real problems at the moment is identity and accuracy and verification. And until they overcome those problems, then they have a really serious core problem, and that's with credibility. I'd like to take you back to the period between the 19th and the 25th of June this year. On the 19th of June, a until then unknown public servant sat before a Senate Estimates Committee. His name was Godwin Gretsch. And that morning there'd been a senior coalition figure in our office who said, "You've got to listen to this testimony today. This will be earth-shattering." They say things like that all the time, so we took it with a grain of salt. But we started listening. And as we listened, this became more and more compelling a testimony. And by about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we started ringing the Prime Minister's office and saying, when is the Prime Minister going to hold a press conference to answer these extremely serious allegations? Of course, we know what happened. By the end of that weekend, we got to the Monday, we were still backing Godwin Gretsch's testimony, but there'd been some question marks put over it. And then I'd put out some calls over the course of the weekend and got one back. And they said, "This guy is now under police investigation. We're on the way to his house at the moment, and we're going to execute a search warrant, and we're going to look through his computer system. And there's every possibility that he concocted this email and then deleted it from the Treasury system and sent it to his home address." Now, I couldn't confirm all of that with a second source, but I confirmed part of that with a second source. So by midday on the first day, we reported the fact that the police were going to execute a search warrant at Godwin Gretsch's home. And through the course of the rest of that day, we managed to confirm some other things. At the end of that night, I remember saying to Greg Jennett, we need to find out who the hell this guy is. Who is Godwin Gretsch? What's going on? And at 7 o'clock the next morning at Aussie's Cafe, I ran into a Liberal who said, "This guy's been giving us information for ages." And so from there we began to try and establish who Godwin Gretsch was and what his motivation could possibly be. By midday that day, we called our lawyers and said, "Look, we believe that this guy has been giving information to Malcolm Turnbull for some time, and we want to write that story." And so then the ABC lawyers got involved. And it didn't just involve me in this chase, then it was the Chief of Staff, our Chief of Staff, it involved Greg Jennett, who's our Bureau Chief. Right up until 5 to 7 that night, Greg Jennett was still on the phone to our lawyers. We had 6 separate people who had confirmed elements of the story, and we said, in part of that story, and one knows it to be the case, which is one short of what I would have liked to go to air with. I would have liked 2 people to say they know that to be the case. And at around about 1 minute to 7, I said to Greg Jennett, we'd better be right, because a lot of people are calling for resignations at the moment. Malcolm Turnbull had called for Kevin Rudd's resignation. Kevin Rudd had called for Malcolm Turnbull's resignation. If we had got that story wrong, people would have been calling for our resignation. So I hate this term, but in the American terms, we had skin in the game on that story. It wasn't just our reputations that were at stake as journalists, it was the ABC's reputation that we were putting on the line with that story. So that was one of those moments where I thought, this threw you back to the basics of journalism. And so whatever platform you want to use, if you want to do political reporting or any other sort of reporting, you have to get the basics right first. And the basics are to confirm the facts, to do your very best to try and find out that what you are going to say about someone, and in this circumstance, something which was clearly defamatory of a number of people, that you do your best to make sure that it's true. And that's, I think, the heart of any kind of reporting. And let's not forget that in that entire story, this was all about an email that was proved to be a fake.